Welcome, everyone. The event is now live. Tracy, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event, 2021, the Modern IT Infrastructure Summit, sponsored by Cloud Health by VMware. I'm Tracy Cook with RedmondMag.com and Virtualization and Cloud Review, and I'd like to thank you so much for joining us today. In this half-day summit, we'll share exactly how new technologies in the area of cloud, backup and recovery, and security can launch your enterprise forward in 2021 while keeping you secure and compliant. We have 3 excellent sessions coming up with our editors and hand-picked industry experts. But before we begin, I'd like to share a couple of housekeeping details. This event is being recorded and will be available for future viewing, and we'll send you an email when the replay is available. We'll also host a Q&A session after each presentation. Please be sure to take this opportunity to get your questions answered by our experts. And finally, Cloud Health by VMware has provided resources that can be found on your console along with all 3 presentations. And now I'd like to welcome Scott Becker, Editorial Director of RedmondMag.com and Virtualization and Cloud Review. He's the moderator of our first session entitled The New Enterprise Cloud Dynamic. It's always great to have Scott with us. He's always a pleasure. So Scott, welcome, and please take it away.
Thanks, Tracy. Appreciate it. And very happy to be here today. Our first session features Howard M. Cohen, who is a senior consultant with the Tech Channel Partners Results Group. He's a 35-plus year executive veteran of the information technology industry, who today writes for and about the IT channel. He's a frequent speaker at IT industry events that include Microsoft Inspire, Citrix Synergy Summit, ConnectWise IT Nation, Cloud Partners Summit, Microcorp One-on-One, and CompTIA ChannelCon. He also frequently hosts and presents webinars for us, so we're in great shape today. Howard, welcome to the webinar.
Hello, Scott. How are you?
I'm great. So I'm looking forward to the session. The floor is yours.
I noticed you threw in the 35 plus. Scott has to throw in an age dig every time. It's just standard. Anyway. Hi, I'm Howard M. Cohen. As Scott said, I write for and about the channel, and I love getting in front of folks like you to talk about industry topics like this one. I particularly liked this one. When I was given the title for this session, it struck me that it's really a wide open title. There's so much you can talk about because, cloud is changing so much, so fast, and it has been for a long time. It's going to continue to for a long time to come. So I thought maybe a little bit I would focus down on the title itself to kind of guide the session. I'm going to pick words out of it and focus in on them a little bit. The first word I'd like to focus in on is new, the new enterprise cloud dynamic. And I'll take issue with it because what we see happening now isn't really so new. Let me take you back to the distant past. This gentleman, you notice behind the panel here, he's playing chess. And indeed, he's playing chess with a big old mainframe computer. We've even got tapes. And if you look right up front, you'll see a card hopper. And there's a time clock in there. This is like ancient. And indeed, this gentleman is John McCarthy. John McCarthy is a real star of the IT industry, an unsung hero. And one of the things about being as old as Scott likes to point out I am, is I always like to throw in a history lesson. Now, this one is really interesting. John McCarthy is considered to be the father of artificial intelligence. Starting in 1956, he was talking about AI. Here, he was part of the team that wrote the chess program that eventually made its way to Watson. He was also the founder of the AI labs, both at MIT and Stanford. That's like playing baseball for the Yankees and the Mets. Oops, showed my New Yorker. Sorry about that. Yeah, but MIT and Stanford, really amazing. A little more about John McCarthy. He invented time sharing. We all remember some of us remember time sharing. And it came back as client-server computing, really, when you come down to it. And today we consider it DAS, desktop as a service. So he invented that, time sharing. He won several awards. The Turing Award, which probably everybody has heard of since the movie The Imitation Game. He won the Kyoto Prize. He won the National Medal of Science. I think the only other person I know who won that is Tony Fauci. And his personal website is still up and available. And I'll give you a couple of seconds. It's worth jotting this one down because if you want a bibliography of absolutely fascinating tech reading, and you're as much of a wirehead as I am, this will keep you fascinated for years. He's got so much stuff there, and really interesting guy. I wanted to share with you, however, one of the things that John McCarthy said. McCarthy said, if computers of the kind I have advocated become the computers of the future, then computing may someday be organized as a public utility, just like the telephone system is a public utility. The computer utility could become the basis of a new and important industry. He was speaking at the MIT Centennial in 1961. That's fully 60 years ago. And what he was talking about was utility computing. Computing becoming as much of a utility as telephone is a utility, or electrical power, gas, oil. These are all utilities. You plug in and you get what you need. He saw this 60 years ago. In 1998, HP finally took John McCarthy on his suggestion and created their utility computing division. HP indeed coined the phrase utility computing before there was cloud. So before there was cloud, there was this concept that computing should be a utility. You just plug in and get what you need. It's like instead of dial tone, you get login. Again, 1998, 22 years ago. It would be like a computer power plant or billing on tap, which was their phrase for consumption-based billing. Pay as you go. So very interesting. This is 1998. The way they described it was interesting too. I mean, they were very, very precise. It's a service provisioning model, which, by the way, for those of you who haven't read the NIST definition of cloud computing, it's a provisioning model in which a service provider makes computing resources and infrastructure management available to the customer as needed and charges them for specific usage rather than a flat fee. 22 years ago, they were talking about what we call cloud today. Like other types of on-demand computing, grid computing was big with IBM in those days. The utility model seeks to maximize the efficient use of resources and or minimize associated costs. They were literally talking about the level of abstraction that cloud puts between the user and the underlying technology. They had this idea decades ago. So utility is the packaging of system resources like compute, store, and services as a media service. It's just like throttling up your storage, throttling up your memory, throttling up or down your processing power. You can do it today. And then they point out that it's a low or no initial cost, just like we do today with cloud, and the resources are essentially rented. Again, how many people are still standing up servers? Pretty much everybody's now moving to using servers in the cloud, and they're renting that space. That is a rental. So the business model is not new. It's 60 years old, really, and 22 in practice. Of course, within 5 or 6 years, as ZDNet points out, in 2004, they ran an article called Utility Computing, What Killed It? It was gone. One day it was the proof of the company's leadership in emerging on-demand adaptive computing pay-as-you-go, which describes cloud. Today, that's hardware and software combination, which allows large-scale heterogeneous IT infrastructure to be aggregated into a dynamically delivered resource pool for applications, is a footnote in computing history. This is 2004. Within the next 5 or 6 years, cloud would become a well-known word, a well-known phrase in our language. And they basically bowed out just to make time for cloud. So it's not new. So when we say the new enterprise cloud dynamic, what we're saying is what goes around comes around. What's old is new again, which we've seen happen time after time in the computing industry. Excuse me. The next word I'd like to take issue with is the word dynamic. And I'm not going to disagree with it. In fact, let's start by defining it. The Merriam-Webster dictionary tells us that it means that it's an adjective meaning something that's marked by usually continuous and productive activity or change. Okay? And that last word is the important one. What's happening in the cloud is continuous, ongoing, and accelerating change. We're going to see some of that in this presentation today. Before we do, how many of you would like to see a cloud? Would you like to see a cloud from the inside? Here we go. Guess whose cloud this is? Yes, no guess. Okay, Amazon is really good at branding. They even brand their clouds. This is a cloud data center, part of Amazon Web Services, that points out, what I'm trying to point out, is that there's no cloud. There are remote data centers. This is a cloud, a remote data center. This one belonging to Amazon. This one belonging to Microsoft. Notice how they all seem to like the blue. This one belongs to Google. There's a little blue in there. The point is that there is no cloud. It's not the cloud. If anything, it's clouds. Many of them. Tens of thousands of them, all around the planet. And we're going to get back to that in a moment. Now, up until recently, actually going back, I mean, even back before McCarthy was talking about utility computing or AI, we were all very busy in the business of integration, right? What was integration? What is integration? It's taking hardware from various manufacturers, software from various providers, and even some services from various providers, and putting them together into a bigger, better solution. As integrators, that's what we did for a living. We put components together into a system. Today, we are still busy doing that. We have all these clouds out there, and today's cloud integrator is busy in the business of integrating those clouds together. However, part of what we're doing at the same time is disintegrating. And we're disintegrating. We're taking things apart. And there's a good reason for it, which you'll see as we move along. Again, return with us to the past. This time we're going back to the 1990s. And back in the 1990s, we had routers. And these routers were used for connecting various geographically dispersed connections together. So if you had multiple locations, you could connect them. Now, the router in and of itself is basically a box, kind of like a junction box where everything connected in. And it was, it did its job, except that it really didn't have much intelligence. It was basically a stupid box, okay? The intelligence, instead, was located in a PC, a basic x86 ISA architecture PC, the kind you'd use at your desk. And the software was loaded into that PC, the PC connected to the router, and the PC operated the router. It controlled the router. And if you wanted to make changes, you could make changes to the software and change the way in which you manage the router. And this was great. This was absolutely great. Then somebody came up with a brilliant idea. They said, well, we could make all of this faster, and we could make all of this much more efficient if we took the intelligence and moved it into the router. Let's put the intelligence in the router. Why keep it separate? This way it's all one thing. We'll put it in firmware in the router. And this was brilliant. And so now the next age of routers all had their intelligence built in. And you could connect into the router with a terminal, and you could manage the router using a terminal connection to the software inside the router. What a great idea. Great idea. And this made routers better and faster. Let's move through time again and come back to the present. Here we are in 2020, and people are complaining that, routers are pretty inflexible. We really can't make big changes to them very easily because, a firmware upgrade is a painful process. They're error prone. They don't often work. And, oh, God, what a mess. And somebody had the idea. Let's do this. Why don't we take the intelligence and move it into the PC? Move it into a PC. In the PC, it's just software. And software can be updated. Software can be modified. We'll have much more flexibility. We'll have much more power over it. They even gave it a name. They called it Software-Defined Networking, SDN. Well, brilliant. Who would have ever thought of this in this decade? Of course, 20, 30 years ago, yeah, it was standard. Okay. This presaged the end of something that many of us old-timers held dear. And how many of you, raise your hands, I can't see you, know what CPE stands for? It's an acronym that's very little used these days, but it stood for Customer Premises Equipment that was on the customer's premises. And now, of course, in the age of the cloud, we're allergic to putting any equipment in the customer's premises. So what's happening now is the end of CPE as we know it. That's what we're bringing about. One more time, traveling, we have software-defined networking. We also have software-defined storage. We even have software-defined wide area networking, SD-WAN. We're software-defining everything. Why? Because we want more flexibility. We want more control. Some of SD-WAN is used now to bypass some of the internet so as not to get hampered by internet latency. Think about that for a minute. Look, internet's not good enough anymore. We need to go past the internet and connect from us, and usually it's a connection from your location to one or more of the big three cloud providers. So in essence, when we connect to the big providers to get all of our infrastructure, all of our servers, all of our applications from the provider, when we go serverless and use the big cloud provider's infrastructure, we're really creating a software-defined data center. We close up ours, we rent that out, or we sell it or repurpose it for some other use, and we no longer have a data center. We're using somebody else's. For most businesses, that is great news. Most businesses didn't go into the IT business. They went into the manufacturing business, or they went into the retail business, or the marketing business, or the legal business, or some other business, and they had to go into the IT business too to run the computers that ran their business. Now, they don't have to run the computers anymore. The computers are being run by professionals at companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, big, massive companies, IBM, Rackspace, others. Okay, so we have a software-defined data center. This creates a very important replacement for those of us who have responsibility for IT shops. It replaces the purchase order with a self-service console. In other words, if I run out of storage, I only have a terabyte, I need another terabyte. Used to be that I would have to issue a purchase order, purchase that extra terabyte of storage from some vendor, wait for it to come, have somebody install it, configure it, format it, prepare it, and then I could make it part of my logical unit. That could take weeks. Now I go over to a self-service portal, I click a button, and I've got my terabyte. I provision my terabyte instantaneously. It's a huge difference. It's a huge difference that sometimes we no longer appreciate. But the idea of not having to wait to make a change is huge in the IT industry. And here it is, a software-defined data center. We can do anything we need to do relatively quickly. More memory, more storage, more processing power, you name it. We can get it, and we can get it with a click. So the way in which we operate in general is dynamically changing. And if you think about it, we've pulled the data center apart. We've disintegrated the data center. It's elsewhere. And it may be several places elsewhere, but it's no longer altogether integrated into one place in our own premises. It's disintegrated. Here's another way in which we've disintegrated. For those of you who are fans of 2001: A Space Odyssey, this is not that monolith. It's a different one. And it's not the monolith that was recently found in the desert. Nobody's figured that one out yet either. This monolith is meant to denote the way in which we've always built software. As far back as I can remember, we built software applications monolithically. That is to say, we put all of the code into one block. Okay, we wrote the whole program. It was all one piece of software. It all got loaded up, and that was great. It ran and did its thing until something went wrong. And if any one little thing went wrong somewhere in the program, it was very likely that it brought the whole program down. That was terrible until we figured out what went wrong and were able to repair it and bring it back up. And that could be, who knows? That could be hours, days, weeks. It could be a lot of time. But let's compare the monolith to the way it's changing today. On the right, you see a Jenga tower. Those of you who have never played Jenga, go out to your local store, get a box of Jenga, call your family members over, and play Jenga. It is fun, and as long as you've got the nerve. If you look at this monolith on the right, if we were to pull out any one block, it's very likely that the entire tower would collapse. It would just fall apart. And that would be bad. On the other hand, on the left, we have a couple of blocks laying around. And if we need one, we'll just pick it up and take it. And it doesn't really affect the other blocks. They don't fall. I mean, we'd have to take that top one off first probably, but they're just laying around. They are referred to as being loosely coupled. That is, there's no dependencies there. They don't need each other for one to operate. If they take one away, the others keep operating. Now, as compared to the monolithic, well, this is a brave new world, right? All of a sudden, we can make changes on the fly and not worry about bringing the whole thing down. But even more to the point, we have replaced monolithic programming completely. Today, instead of doing a monolith that has all the services built in, we build little tiny microservices. Okay, microservices. And each one of these microservices does something that used to be done inside the monolith. As a matter of fact, when we look at all the microservices, they are basically the collection of services that were in the monolith, now taken completely apart, or again, disintegrated. We've disintegrated the software solution to become lots of little tiny single services. And those services can be called as needed. And here's the beauty of this. The service is put into a container. In that container, we also put all the resources that service needs to operate, that microservice needs to operate. That container can then be transported anywhere in the cloud we need it to go, to run wherever we need it to run, to perform whatever function we need it to perform. It's completely flexible. This is why, microservices in containers are referred to as cloud native programming. Cloud native, because they were built to operate in the cloud. Here's another beautiful thing about microservices in containers. Let's say that we instantiate a microservice. That is, the system calls upon one of the microservices to operate and execute. And we start to put it into the container with all the resources. Oh, something goes wrong. It can happen. It happened in the monolith. Something goes wrong, and that microservice and that container are malformed. What happens? What happens is the system discards it. Just discards it. Doesn't try to fix it. Doesn't waste time on it. It discards it, and it reinstantiates. It creates a new one. So we throw away the one that didn't work. We build a new one. Until we're satisfied that it's working, we keep on doing that. And usually it doesn't take much. And now we've got a fully formed microservice, and off we go. Nothing else fell down. Nothing else stopped working. Nothing else slowed down. The microservice reinstantiated and moved on. Now, that means that things can go wrong in our software that don't bring the whole thing down. The word you're looking for to describe that is resilience. This is a much more resilient approach to programming. And indeed, if we look at the thinking that's gone into where we're going with cloud, it's all about resilience. It's all about insulating the system from failure. You know, you've heard of fault-tolerant systems. This is fault-tolerant on steroids. Everything we do to increase resilience. I mean, the whole idea of DevOps, partnering the developers and the operations people together. The whole idea is to create more resilience, aligning their operations together, aligning the way they work together, and getting them to both work together to get feedback back so they can improve everything constantly. Constant improvement through constant deployment. Amazing. Okay, so now we've got microservices and containers. They are a product of disintegration. So the monolith is tightly coupled. We used this phrase before. Tightly coupled. Any one thing goes wrong, everything goes wrong. This is monolithic programming. The blocks, they're loosely coupled. They don't really have dependency on each other. Microservices, a very simple comparison. Okay, so we're continuing to disintegrate the title of this session. The next word I want to talk about is cloud, which from now on we really need to think about as clouds, not cloud. Remember we said before, there is no cloud? Remember the commercials, let's go to the cloud. There's no such thing. There is no man behind the curtain, I am the great and powerful Oz. Doesn't exist. There are tens of thousands, maybe even more, of data centers, each one providing cloud-based services. And cloud is a provisioning platform described by the National Institute for Standards and Technology years ago in a great document that everybody should read. If you haven't read it, it's 4 pages. You can read it in a heartbeat. It's really quick. But you will see that it completely defines what we mean by cloud. It's not cloudy at all. It's very clear. So instead of cloud, we're going to talk about clouds, right? This has actually been the way it's been since the very beginning. we just didn't talk about it much. Like you used to get, let's say, your Office suite from Microsoft or IBM Lotus back in the day, Google. Then you got your backup from any one of hundreds of choices. There's tons of cloud backup services available to you, high availability services, all kinds of services, all available from various different cloud providers. And good news for you, you could pick and choose which ones you wanted to get what from and combine the best of breed from everything into one place, your cloud system. And that is cloud integration. That's the definition of it. Well, here's the good news. Cloud definition of integration has gone further. Not only are you choosing small services from various different providers, now you're choosing services from big providers. You've heard the phrase multi-cloud used. Let's define it here. You talk about the big three, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, right? Three big services. The thing is, it's more than just the cloud service, right? When we think of the cloud service, we're probably thinking about infrastructure as a service. You can get server from the cloud. And as a matter of fact, just about everything they sell you is packaged in a virtual machine, a virtual server. So it's an appropriate metaphor. But there's much more to it than that now. Here's the list of service categories that are available from Amazon Web Services. Here's a list of the service categories that are available from Google Cloud, just the categories. Here are the service categories from Microsoft Azure. Now, if you look at these lists, and this is important, if you look at these lists, you'll notice that some of the names are the same. They each probably have storage, for example, and compute. Those are definitely available from all three. Networking, available from all three, without a doubt. But then there are other services, which one may call one thing, and another may call something else. This is something you've got to be careful of. You've got to be really careful to make sure you're comparing apples versus apples. But the good news is that you can compare and shop. That is to say, you can get compute and storage and even networking from one of them. You can get databases from another. You can get microservices and containers from yet another. You can get mixed reality from one of them. You can get identity and access from another. You can get Internet of Things. All of them seem to have game development. I think that's interesting to point out. But the point is that you can pick and choose whose service you like best from within the big three, and you can be operating multi-clouds at once. And today, that is very manageable. There are single management platforms, single consoles that you can use to manage your use of services from wherever they come. So once again, we are integrating. We're integrating service from different big providers. This is kind of like department stores as opposed to the strip malls of old, right? The internet before, the cloud was strip mall with lots of little cloud stores. Here we have the big three department stores and all of their departments, and you can pick and choose. You don't have to shop at just one. You can shop at all three. So this tells us that integration has taken a whole new turn in the cloud. We are now integrating services from wherever we want to get them. If we like one cloud database service is better than another, no problem. We go get it from there. This actually increases the complexity, which means it increases the value proposition for those of you who become cloud integrators, because there's much more you need to know, and you can vend that knowledge. That's valuable. And clients want to pay you for that because they certainly don't want to have to figure it out themselves. So this is all good news. It makes it a much more robust environment to work in. And combined with everything else, you're now disintegrating and integrating at the same time, pulling things apart so that they're loosely coupled, so there were fewer dependencies, but integrating things from different places to come up with the best possible solution. And as far back as you do go in this industry, when has that not been the objective? It's always been the same, to come up with the best possible solution and keep adapting that solution so it always remains the best solution. Okay. The next component of the cloud that I want to talk about is the one that it's all about. All right, we've been talking about services. We've been talking about architecture. We've been talking about monolithic versus container-based microservice programming. I mean, all interesting. But at the end of the day, it's all about what I'm going to show you in this next slide. And by the way, the other reason I included this next slide is because Scott Becker truly loves this slide. It's all about bacon. No, it's not all about bacon. It's all about data, which many people have referred to as the new bacon, or the new oil, or the new gold. What they're trying to say is it's the most valuable thing. It's the thing people want the most and value the most because it's your data. I mean, it's what your business runs on. It's what your life runs on. If you think about it, you're a mass of numbers, your social security number, your bank account, your account numbers with your favorite credit card. I mean, you are data. We are all data, and data is what it's all about. Everything we do is meant to move data because data only gains value when it's in motion. Okay, it's all about data. So let's talk about the new ways in which data is managed in the cloud. We've all heard about elasticity, right? Well, the new data management manages that elasticity. That is to say, you can go to a console and you can say, I need more storage. Okay, you've got more storage. You can go back to the console and say, okay, that season is over. We've dumped all of that. I don't want to keep paying for that storage. So you turn that storage off. You are no longer paying for it. You can't do that in the premise world. You can't give back storage and get your money back. But now you can stop paying for excess storage once you stop using it. Just release it. That's the whole world. The whole world is request and release. Request and release. And the thing you have to watch most is release, because people will forget to release and you'll be paying for something that nobody's using. Okay, elasticity. In the new data management, we manage the accessibility to the data and the scaling of the data. Well, we just talked about getting more storage. You can get more storage with a click. So scaling becomes incidental. Accessibility, we need to make sure that the people who are getting at the data have the right to get at the data, have approval to get at the data, and to use the data in the way they want to. So accessibility to the data is managed in the new data management console. Most of you know what metadata is. That metadata is basically data about data. When you save a message or in blockchain and you do a transaction, it's time-stamped, right? And that timestamp is metadata. And it must be maintained because it will become very, very useful later on. So time-indexed metadata is crucial in today's cloud applications. Global scale-out, the ability to scale out across the cloud, across the network, so anybody and everybody can get at the data they need when they need it. This is horizontal. We can scale up by getting more storage. We can scale out by broadening the storage. So global scale-out is also handled at the new data management in the cloud. Deduplication, the thing we're all scared of most. Everybody wants deduplication because they don't want to have to waste storage on having the same file stored time after time after time. But nobody wants to run deduplication because they're afraid it'll delete files that they think they need. Bottom line, deduplication is available. Another important function, auto-tiering. Tiering storage means taking the cheap storage and using it for files that are seldom used. It's like cold storage. You put it away for another day, and you're not doing a lot of transactions in and out, so you can use industry standard storage and cheap drives and tuck it away somewhere. On the other hand, when people are doing thousands upon thousands of transactions an hour, you want that going through to and from storage that is solid state. And up until recently, that's been much more expensive. Now it's a little more expensive, and soon it won't be more expensive. But tiering is still an important thing, so you're making sure you're using the right storage for each different kind of application. RESTful APIs for access, so that you can control access in very extreme, very critical ways. Highly elastic search and analytics capabilities. Today, e-discovery is de rigueur. You have to have e-discovery capability. Most federal rules require that you have the ability to access any piece of information all but instantly. So again, that needs to be there. And again, it is in the new data management console. So you've got data storage, you've got management, orchestration, backup, security, compliance. It's all in this one control plane. It's all together where you can get at it. Okay, and it's swappable, so you still have choice. The other thing that you need to protect yourself, we've talked about security protection here. We've talked about accessibility protection here. We've talked about data protection here. The ultimate in data protection, of course, is a redundant system. So as far back as we can remember, we were always entreated to build a redundant server, a backup server. This started out with Novell's fault-tolerant servers. Well, okay, so it was two servers that were identical, and one was primary, the other was secondary, and if something went wrong with the primary server, the software failed everybody over to the backup server, and all the data was there because it was constantly being replicated. Terrific. Some people back then, some customers, small customers, balked at the idea of buying two servers when they only needed one. Today, I think that's not an argument. But in larger applications where the idea was to build a redundant data center, in other words, have a complete duplicate of your entire data center, depending on the size of your company, that was a mammoth investment. That data center was not only supposed to accommodate data, it was supposed to accommodate people too. People could go over to the warm site and work from there if indeed the primary data center was completely destroyed. This became very popular, unfortunately, after 9/11. The idea of a redundant data center was no longer crazy. We had seen it in action. And I was one of those people back then who was busily trying to help customers immediately erect a new data center to replace the one that they had lost when the towers fell. It's no joke. Having a redundant data center is critical because who knows what will happen. Well, the good news is today, that concept has become a lot less expensive. That is to say, today, you can have redundancy. When you sign up for a cloud service, this map is the map of where all of Microsoft's data centers are. I could just as easily put up Google's or Amazon's. It'd be the same thing, a marketer map with dots all over the place. They have tons of data centers. When you sign up for one, the one that I use is actually located physically in Kazakhstan. I don't know why it's there. They chose that. But I went and looked at the properties, and I saw that my server is in Kazakhstan. And I could have a backup server in London for all I know, and maybe a third one in Dallas, Texas. That does not require me to build a thing or invest a dime. And so cloud makes it possible for us to provide redundancy, completely redundant data centers with failover, so that if, God forbid, one data center gets obliterated, we can fail over to another data center and the clients can still function. And this is just getting better and better. Of course, despite the fact that we've got redundancy, I'm still going to tell you that it's crucial for you to create more than that. This is simply not enough. You need belt and suspender security. That is to say, in addition to cloud backup, you still need local backup. You need to have, or you need a third-party backup, because it is possible for everything to be destroyed in any given system. And the person who owns fiduciary responsibility for data is you. Not your providers, not your vendors, you. You, the company that owns the data, you own fiduciary responsibility to your stakeholders for said data. And so you can't depend on anybody else, no matter how much their contract says you've got, 5 nines of reliability, quality of service. It'll never go down. You can't buy into that, because ask yourself this simple question. If, God forbid, that huge amount of data is suddenly lost forever, who do you think is getting fired? Put it in personal perspective. These are career-threatening things. You've got to make sure you have a last-ditch backup. And so those third-party or local backup solutions are still crucially important to provide that last layer of protection. Okay, let me wrap up with some takeaways, and then we'll see if we have some questions. Takeaway number 1, instantiate everything. Buy nothing. If you're buying servers or storage or power supplies or what have you, anything other than maybe a router or a switch, you're making a mistake. You don't want to do anything on premise anymore. And if anything has hastened that, accelerated that, it's this COVID-19 pandemic. You don't need a router or a switch anymore. Everybody's working from home. They have their own little router and their own switches, and they can work from there. And I'm going to bet you that a lot of them are not coming back. I think the industry that's going to be hardest hit when we get past the pandemic is going to be commercial real estate, because a lot of businesses are not coming back. Twitter was first. They were the first to say everybody works from home from now on. From now on. Loose coupling. Think about loose coupling in everything you do. Disintegrate wherever you can. Eliminate dependencies. Get them out of there. If one thing going lets everything else go, you got a mistake. You got to fix that. Because every time you eliminate a dependency, you increase your resilience. And resilience is the most crucial thing, because then you don't have to worry as much. And that's a nice thing. At the same time, integrate. Integrate services from different vendors. Find the one you like best and use that one. That's one of the great advantages of cloud since day one, that you can pick and choose. And if you don't like what you've got, you can actually just shut it down, sign up for somebody else's. It's not like you're throwing away an investment. You're simply bringing down a system, migrating the data, and off you go. So integrate services, pick the one you like best, and don't cast it in stone. You may want to change someday soon. Remember that with today's consoles, you've got the best visibility you've ever had. You've got visibility of everything. Who's using what? How much are they using it? What resources are sitting out there idle for extended periods of time, which means that somebody forgot to release them, and you're paying for them for no reason. Shut them off. So use that visibility. Make sure that you're always on top of your system, monitoring your system, and you've got a standard process for that. And finally, if there's anything that is most important to continued operation, it's manage the money. This is the part that so many techs forget. Okay, anybody who's on the technical side of the business has to remember the money side of the business, because your budget is what makes your business go. It's what makes your IT systems go. And so you've got to make sure you're not wasting it. You've got to make sure you're not letting it get corrupted. You've got to make sure that you've got the best of breed. You've got to make sure you're making good use of the budget you have, because anything you don't use, you lose twice. You lose this year's allocation, and you're not going to get the same allocation next year. So again, manage the money. Keep an eye on how much it's costing you, and that will save you from some of the worst mistakes that are made in IT. Okay, so we're integrating and we're disintegrating. And with that, I'm going to ask Scott to come on back. Oh, I'm sorry. Remember the ultimate oxymoron. I forgot the ultimate oxymoron, which is constant change. Change is the only constant. It's crazy, but it's true. The only constant, the only thing that remains constant is that things change. And in IT, celebrate the change. Innovate, innovate, innovate. If you're sitting still, you're dying. It's like a shark. You have to keep moving. And now that we're all sharks, Scott, do we have any questions?
Yeah, just first off, I will confirm that the bacon slide is in fact my favorite. It's just mesmerizing. That ocean, the sight of the bacon. I'm glad I can't smell it, or I'd be done for. So, yeah, that was a great overview. Set up our second session on security really nicely, and our backup session in the third slot. We do have a couple of questions that have come in here. So let me start with Kalpesh's question, and this probably relates to your conclusion about not buying too much on premises hardware. He's asking, what if companies have a hybrid approach, part work from home and part on site?
Okay, so my immediate answer to that, you use the word hybrid. Absolutely. Everything is hybrid. Think about it. Everything is hybrid. I don't know anybody who doesn't have something on-prem, some things in public cloud, some things in private cloud. It's going to be that way for a long time to come. Nobody is purely public cloud or purely private cloud. The fact is we now have the flexibility, and that's hopefully something that I illustrated in this presentation. We have ultimate flexibility. We can put anything, anywhere. If we can move the entire workforce of the world working in offices to working from home in a day, we can do anything. So to me, hybrid, that's what we've had forever. We've had people working from home and people working in the office forever. Way back to when Robert Frankenberg first told us that work is an activity, not a destination. That was 1994. We've always had hybrids of work in the office and work at home. And so, especially if your infrastructure is sitting centrally in a cloud data center, connecting to it is really no different from one place or the other. You could be, as we used to joke, you could be sitting by the pool and working on a laptop or a tablet. Just don't drop it in the pool.
And we also had a question from Michael, which is it's sort of along a similar vein, but he has some interesting ideas in here. He said, Howard, don't you think we can model a more secure, inclusive, and supportive network of distributed work centers, especially since we now understand the limitations of work from home? We should use the need for a better distributed work model to create more resilient regional networks, distributed office capacity. It's about teaching communities how to harness these technologies just as they would consider building a transit or train station or highway access ramps. Kind of a long thought there, but spark anything for you?
Yeah, I'll go back to my friend Mark Templeton, who used to be CEO at Citrix. Way back in the beginning with Citrix, Mark explained that, and this is, you think about we talk about the user experience today. Mark was talking about the user experience back in the late 1980s, early 1990s. I mean, that was 30 some odd years ago. And one of the things he said was that his goal, his personal goal, was to make it possible for somebody to obtain the same experience wherever they logged in. Didn't matter where they were. They could be at a kiosk. They could be at a regional center. They could be in a hoteling center, if you will, where there are computers available that you can sit down, like you have in a hotel, or some airports have them now too. They're always at trade shows. You can walk up, you can log in, you can get your mail, you can do whatever you need to do. Expanding that concept, the idea was always to be able to log in anywhere and get the same experience, get the same access to data, be able to do all the same work. And if you look at the web apps that Microsoft is now providing, and the G Suite, and the way it's being delivered by Google, this is where we're going. We're disintegrating the software from the client device. The client device will become inconsequential, which will be wonderful, because then I can take my desktop computer that I despise and throw it out, get another one, and not have to do anything to it. Just hook it up. Kind of like the old days of thin client. Another one of Mark's innovations. Simple. No storage, nothing at the station other than memory, and the ability to work. I think that, I agree that for the democratization of computing, it's a wonderful thing. From the standpoint of our economy, I'm not going to get deep into it. I think it's going to be a difficult thing at best.
Okay. Well, I think we're gonna leave it there. But Howard, thanks as always. It was a great session. And I also want to thank Cloud Health, and I also want to thank Cloud Health by VMware for sponsoring today's event. And with that, I'm going to kick it back over to Tracy. Tracy, take it away.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Scott and Howard. That was a really interesting session, so we really appreciate you being here. We're going to go on a short break until about the top of the hour for our second session, and that's the mess of 2020 and the world we need in 2021 and beyond. So we'll be back at around 10 a.m. Pacific for our second session. Please stay with us. Thank you so much.
Welcome back to our second session. David, please take it away.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review. Thanks for staying on the call for our second session, the mess of 2020 and the world we need in 2021 and beyond. Our speaker is Ian Thornton Trump, CD, an ITIL certified IT professional with 25 years of experience in IT and security. As Chief Information Security Officer for Cyjax Limited, Ian has deep experience with the threats facing small, medium, and enterprise businesses. His research and experience have made him a sought-after cybersecurity consultant specializing in cyber threat intelligence programs for small, medium, enterprise organizations. In his spare time, he teaches cybersecurity and IT business courses for CompTIA as part of their global faculty and is the lead architect for CyberTitan, Canada's efforts to encourage the next generation of cyber professionals. Ian, it's great to have you here today. I'm excited to hear what you have to say, and I look forward to your presentation. Please take it away.
Hey, thank you very much, David. It's fantastic to be here. Really, truly appreciate the introduction and all the good folks for getting me involved. That's a huge shout out to Tracy Cook, of course, who I know from a former life when we worked for the same organization. Of course, the great Scott Becker as well, who I'm a huge fan of his work. So, folks, you're in for a bit of a wild ride, and it's going to echo some of the things that the previous presentation talked about. However, I'm taking it in a much higher, a much more strategic direction, simply because my background and what I sort of view things through is a very geopolitical and cyber threat intelligence lens. And clearly, the last few months have been, well, let's say the last year has been quite interesting from both the threat landscape perspective as well as the perspective from cyber threat actors as well. So we're going to get into that, and I'm going to be saying a few pretty shocking things, as I am known to do. However, I will try and keep it into the realms of IT without getting too political at this time. I've actually been an intelligence analyst twice in my life, once for the Canadian Forces and once indeed for the RCMP. So, pretty famous painting hanging in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, USA. This one is called The Fall of Rome. And quite frankly, 2020 felt like being on the walls of Rome at approximately 410 AD, looking out at barbarian hordes coming to completely destroy and ruin our way of life. Now, if that wasn't uplifting enough, we then quickly discovered that a lot of our things about our society, a lot of the places that we took comfort and refuge in had been upended by the pandemic response. However, there are a number of lessons learned that came out of this experience, and I'm going to kind of go through them, with the song "It's the End of the World as We Know It" from REM echoing in the background. But these lessons learned are things that, as the previous speaker said, had been around for quite some time. But I think also when we put it into context of how we relate and work with the internet and how important it's become in our daily lives, there's some compelling trends that will echo quite a lot moving forward in the years past 2021 and quite possibly even into 2030 and beyond. So a few of the things that we learned was that diversity is equal to resilience. Dependency indeed increases vulnerability, as the previous speaker talked about, and we'll get into that a little bit. Control leads to predictability. Observation is information. The health of the people is the health of the state. One of my favorite sayings from a general that worked for General Patton is vision without resources is hallucination, and I hear the chuckles of all the folks that have worked in IT in one capacity or another. Complexity is the enemy of security, and 70 to 93% of all communication is nonverbal. So we're going to tie that all together. But first, let's talk about rule number 1, where diversity is equal to resilience. Now, certainly as a result of the mass work from home, as a result of lockdowns, as a result of the curtailment of a lot of our activities related to even leisure in our society, the internet has now become a critical service. And we'll talk about what that really means in a moment, but I think what we found is that the general problems that we had in relationships, be it at work, be it at leisure, be it with your significant other, were exacerbated by the sudden arrival of the pandemic and the response that various governments took. And I say that humans convert to future. We've looked in the past and we've seen disruptive activity take place, be it conflict in some conflicts in cyberspace, and also some of the issues that we see in our physical world. So the most important thing to sort of understand is that technologically, the requirement for technology and technology literacy has really exploded and accelerated. I mean, it was already going in a certain direction because of, the app ecosystem that we rely on, and all of the different things that we rely on are now being delivered more and more over the internet. But one of the most destructive phrases that I've seen in my travels is the words, "I'm not technical." And unfortunately, everyone now has to become technical because of that reliance on that technical medium that we have. So I think it's really important to understand that the words "I'm not technical" are a clarion call to understand the basics of the tools that you need in order to fulfill your role in our westernized society and democracy. The other aspect that I want to talk about is because of that technical acceleration, that technical literacy, we're now asked to understand the security environment that we have. And I think what we've seen is a dramatic response of some organizations that are still focused on fear and uncertainty and doubt. But many others have started to look at the influencer and education focus in terms of selling. But suffice it to say that for both cyber criminals and for the actual commercial operations of the society, small and medium business are actually the drivers of the economy. And when small and medium businesses suffer as a result of the pandemic responses that we've seen, we end up in a situation which is dire. And this has gone to, I think, really come to a head when we look at a World Economic Forum report called The Great Reset, which I highly recommend reading, is that we need to look at globalization and look at it in a different light. Now, one of the most important things that we discovered in the early phases of the pandemic was a lack of the personal protective equipment, or PPE as we call it, because global supply chains had actually been reduced to a few foreign suppliers. And all of a sudden, there was a great rush for this equipment. The interesting thing is that this affected a whole bunch of different services in different and dramatic ways. And we'll talk a little bit about those experiences as we get into the meat of the presentation. So, 2 rules on one slide. Dependency increases vulnerability and control leads to predictability. 2 important concepts to understand is that unfortunately, because one of our sole conduits to information and to work and to leisure has been the internet, it's become easy to manipulate the beliefs through misinformation. It's also managed to concentrate power into the government in terms of public health orders and putting a state to control behavior that then became politicized across a number of different situations, such as the Black Lives Matter movement, such as anti-masking, conspiracy theories, etc. one of the things that we learned from this is that the more connected we became, the more fragile the nature and resilience of our society was. And in fact, what I would suggest to you is that we have shown a tremendous amount of resilience, but at the same time, we've seen the fragility of our organizations. And to give you an example of how that fragility played out, at least in the UK, when everyone was ordered into lockdown, the government made the assumption that we could just order our groceries online easily. Unfortunately, what the government failed to do was inform the various grocers that there would be a sudden almost 100% increase in the requirements for ordering at line. There wasn't enough deliveries. There wasn't enough supply in the supply chain to address the hoarding issues. There wasn't enough server, memory, and CPU and storage capacity in the online portals because only at the time about 10% of the entire UK ordered their groceries online to have them delivered. So all of a sudden, things needed to change. For instance, seniors, and we'll talk a little bit about the disenfranchisement of certain groups and the elevation of other groups in a moment. But seniors and NHS workers had to have special accommodations because of the very requirement to deliver services or to be in isolated lockdown. We also learned a lot about the fragile nature but the potential for resilience of the planet itself, specifically along the mass reductions in carbon dioxide and what the effect on the environment had when we saw the return of animal life into areas that had been far too polluted. I remember seeing pictures from Venice of fish in the canals and a surge in the amount of animal life and the return of seals to the Thames estuary. And all of these things bode positive and show that collectively we can change our fates. But one of the things that we saw, because of the internet being this main conduit for leisure, for work, for entertainment, and for home, was a massive growth required. A complete massive growth required in our infrastructure. I just got some instructions here from Tracy to refresh my browser. So hopefully I am seeing this and there. Hopefully that fixed the problem. So we required a massive amount of growth in the internet and the demand for various services, especially around cloud computing services, because of the sudden digital transformation and sudden work from home. And in a bit contrary to the previous presenter, I would suggest that there were some vital parts of your organization where work from home, of going from the high-speed, high-storage networks that people that work in graphic design or AutoCAD use, moving them to work from home was not a pleasurable experience, and in fact was very difficult because of the bandwidth considerations of home DSL connections. But also what we found was a massive reliability was required in critical services, mostly because many of the critical services, such as food and financial assistance for your business, were only available over the internet in terms of applications. Nothing can be done in person anymore. This dramatically, in turn, increased the human attack surface because as more of what we buy and the advent of the cashless society dawned, we now became an algorithm of our habits because all of our habits could be easily tracked, which opened up a huge issue in terms of our personal privacy. And this quote was really interesting because as a result of social media, as a result of people dissenting with what seemed like at the time scientific advice or the politicization of scientific advice, we saw an infodemic of misinformation, some of it perpetrated by folks that have long been protagonists of westernized democracy. Observation is information. this becomes a really interesting situation where the one thing that we do permeates all of the aspects to our personalities and to our ways of providing value in both our society and our work. We found that the internet became responsible for learning and education, along with leisure and work. Streaming content and games competed at the bandwidth level for VPN, remote desktop, and other hosted services. This changed a complete change in consumerism, and the cashless society has been realized broadly, and that now even some stores are refusing legal tender, citing public health concerns. So the cyber impacts of this in particular have become massive, whether it's personal privacy issues related to the gobbling up of sensitive data, or the physical security concerns that we have with regards to the IoT devices that we've welcomed into our homes. Specifically because we were getting more packages delivered to our homes, there was a concern of security of those very packages. So the response has been to increase our own personal surveillance of the areas just around our dwelling place. And now on Reddit and other mediums, we see wide-scale deployment of CCTV and Ring doorbell cameras, for instance. The privacy versus security argument has once again resurged, mostly because so much of our lives are online. The information that law enforcement and counter-terrorist terrorist organizations need is found predominantly online. So unfortunately, virtual chat rooms where sinister things are being discussed has led to all sorts of cyber requirements in terms of investigation and prosecution. Unlike before, where police forces are struggling to deal with epidemic levels of fraud, we now see that fraud becoming a mainstream concern in the cyber realm. And this led to an increase in domestic violence, bullying and harassment, and child exploitation material. As a result of the conduit of the internet becoming the most critical service that we're faced with, other than perhaps even power itself, we have now opened up Pandora's box of very negative and disturbing things. So, the health of the people is the health of the state. The question now becomes who is responsible for the welfare of the people. Government rules and guidance, politicized, or science in all of its rawness, potentially demanding complete compliance and the complete shutdowns of economy. The government is in a very difficult position because more and more the government had to put these government support programs online as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, that caused a massive amount of security vulnerability, not so much in the actual transition to the internet itself, but because cyber criminals were quick to prey upon this particular situation. As you know, one of the early stages of the pandemic, hydroxychloroquine was heralded as being a possible drug that would mitigate, if not reduce, the likelihood of severe COVID-19 infection. What happened at that particular point was truly interesting because within 12 hours, hydroxychloroquine websites and phishing websites, including SMS texting, were offered online in both the dark markets and in the public markets. And this became the frequency of a quick adaptability of cyber criminals at unprecedented levels in the midst of a global pandemic to spew all sorts of different misinformation and dangerous malware into the internet. Again, the attack surface was amplified because people were already under a certain amount of stress. And we all know from behaviors, human behavior, that when people are stressed, what happens to them is they make mistakes. And there was interesting development, too, where we saw the emergence of the human right to the internet. And the very questions of, is the internet an essential service? What is the governance that is required to ensure that essential services remain in place? The argument stems from the fact that everyone moved online at a rapid pace, but however, what we fail to understand is there's certain parts of our society that are somewhat disfranchised from the internet itself, including the disabled and perhaps the elderly. There's also been a movement right now in terms of adopting what's called strict liability. Strict liability is where the default is you're guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. We've seen this invade the idea of banning end-to-end encryption, because the default belief is that anyone using end-to-end encryption is not a privacy advocate, but is a criminal conducting some sort of malicious action, or rather that's what the government policy wonks would have you believe. We've seen the disenfranchisement of many types of people, the arts, seniors, the disabled. But we've also seen the promotion of many types of people that are critical or vital, including package delivery and mail services, especially in the United States. However, these people, in many cases, are not adequately rewarded or compensated for the vitality that they're playing in our society today. There's a disconnection between the government responsibility and industry responsibility, and unfortunately, more of the welfare services are predisposed to considering that there is malicious intent and or fraudulent intent, and so more eligibility checks and more difficult processes are unleashed on the unsuspecting public. This was the case where a Jamaican cybercrime crew who had registered thousands of false identities for various United States welfare programs at the state level and collected millions of dollars of benefits were recently brought to justice. So unfortunately, as a result of having this one attack surface in our society, we have attracted, almost like the proverbial moth and light bulb, a variety of different threat actors, ranging from the very simple business email compromise type of attacks to very sophisticated malware. Vision without resources is hallucination, and complexity is the enemy of security. This is where my colleague and I that presented earlier really do see some very interesting developments in our society, which is going to shape the future to come and reverberate for many, many years. Now, first of all, I think it's fair to say that the 18th century notions of work panopticon, the open office, and it being a cesspit of infection vectors is long since gone. The idea of shared workspaces are inherently a health concern, and were a health concern before we even had a global pandemic. We've seen the reduction and disappearance of entire industry verticals, especially ones that were mostly geared around face-to-face interaction, such as the hospitality industry. We've seen regional and national disparities changing. The ultimate goal for anyone in the UK is to get a London wage, but not live in London and live in a far more economical place, or a far more human place that has a space and perhaps a closer connection to nature. And in fact, one of the issues that we have is this proverbial snake eating the tail, in that if the actual cultural institutions and the vibrancy of the nightlife and restaurants are curtailed because of the public gatherings, then the desire to live in a cultural place and the desire to live close to the action, as it were, is no longer a valid reason. And the problem that my colleague talked about with commercial debt finance real estate is truly a phenomenal one. As I read 2 days ago, I believe it was in Bloomberg or The Economist, about how they're looking at converting office space into live work spaces, as we find that more and more of our lives are spent needlessly commuting or needlessly spending money simply because we're out of the comfort of our homes. This is an economic bombshell that will fall in several years as commercial property, as malls and other places are largely abandoned in favor of our cozy and secure houses without the potential of infection. Because don't forget, even though we will have a vaccine and there will be some people that are very hopeful that we return back to normal, the question is do we really want to be normal, because this is what got us into the problem in the first place. And a whole bunch of jobs that we know it. This could be akin to the disruption that the horse and buggy faced with the arrival of the motor car. I think what we've seen, too, from the cyber side of it is a profound impact on traditional corporate IT support. The reality for corporate IT in the pandemic era was to support the users no matter what they had for equipment, no matter what type of internet router they had. Normal IT support revolved around the idea of being able to do trouble tickets and remote access within the confines of the corporate envelope. Now remote access is required onto desktops in myriad shapes and sizes. And that's why we saw a whole explosion of collaborative applications in order to deliver services and to deliver some sort of semblance of the collaboration that we saw before that. Many organizations suddenly found themselves online and suddenly exposed themselves to all sorts of perils, be it unpatched VPN servers, be it exposed remote desktop protocol without multi-factor authentication, exposed to the entirety of the internet, simply because the investments in secure computing may not have been made by the organizations, and those quickly enabled services to try and keep the business still functional ended up introducing threat landscape issues that were only too readily exploited by some of the most virulent cyber criminal ransomware gangs that are out there. And I think what was interesting is we saw some organizations prosper incredibly as a result. And we saw the emergence of a new business model, which I think Harvard will be talking about for some time, which involved good enough security. And then once popularity and market share was gained, a huge investment in security as a result of scrutinization by free resources. This is the Zoom story. Zoom started out, as you can see, in 2019 with a modest profit, but is forecasted to be almost 100 times what they were in a matter of 2 years. Completely amazing. But what was interesting about Zoom's approach was its enlightened view of its relationship with security. Rather than taking the approach of many organizations, which is to deny that there is any sort of problem, or to minimize the problem or the attack surface, or to waffle on the idea that perhaps it was of limited impact or a small issue. They embraced the sometimes harsh criticism levied at them. They spent money, including bringing in Alex Stamos, the former CEO of, or CIO of, or CISO of Facebook and Yahoo, to address security problems at a very high level. And they made purchases with their new found wealth in order to adopt those intellectual property that they outright purchased into their product to make it more secure. So this is a very interesting business model that I'm sure we'll see more of as time goes on. So this is one of the last rules, Rule 8, as it were, with 70 to 93% of all communication being nonverbal. This is a very interesting stat when we look at chat and video conferencing technologies and find them that they're dual use, that they've impacted our daily lives in all sorts of different ways, from work to relationships. This is problematic in that if nonverbal communication, 70 to 93% of communication is all nonverbal, and we're reduced to Slack and Teams and chat and text messaging, this becomes a poor substitute for face-to-face communication, especially when it comes to tough issues or disciplinary action within an organization. This needs that human-to-human connection, and unfortunately, the untimely departure of the internet proves to be more severe and taken more severely by an audience that perhaps is trying to be motivated by leadership. So what we're seeing is that because of this situation, we are more susceptible, because things like humor and nuance aren't necessarily communicated particularly well over these types of mediums. And it leads to a feeling of being connected. However, at the same time, it can be a feeling of isolation, especially for those people that the variety of leadership talents that they have were really about collaborating and getting to know people and being emotionally and self-aware of how they fit into the workplace. And I know that, from my personal perspective, in order to understand what is going on inside my organization or other organizations, I really do need to have conversations with the people. And sometimes those conversations take much longer than 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour, as we've now broken up our calendars into. It takes perhaps a lot of insight and the willingness to cancel meetings in order to continue the dialogue or discussion, especially when moments of creativity or emotional sensitivity are often manifest. And I think, in a sense, we've become more of the isolated member of the herd, and we're definitely more exposed to the predators of the internet, especially with organized cybercrime groups. And without that human interaction, without the discipline to take breaks, without somebody coming by and offering you a coffee and a kind word, we have a tendency to blend our work and not take enough time and breaks. And this is important, especially for the leadership within IT, is that we are paid to look for insight and to understand the tough problems. And we need to give ourselves time to let our mind wander and to look for that golden moment where we suddenly have that aha moment that now charts a course around a particular obstacle. Because at the high levels of our organization, we really do get paid to understand problems and solve them. The other thing that I think is important to point out is that we have seen an issue with regards to the toxicity on social media and a great deal of divisiveness, be it around issues regarding the masks, the presidential election, the tiered system. It has become more divisive than ever. And unfortunately, many folks who lack the self-awareness and intellect and perhaps are too unwilling to see the fruits of dialogue result in perpetrating and harassment. And what I've seen online in the last little while has been difficulty reconciling online personalities with the relationships that we have. Clearly, in my presenting mode, in my passionate address, this is maybe not an appropriate type of persona to use with, a mother or sister in conversations. And I think one of the things that we have done is, because information and is now become a leisure activity as well, of just surfing the internet to see what's out there, we are now open to bad and controversial ideas and conspiracy theories, especially when forwarded to us by people, peers, or by friends that we normally have a great deal of respect for. And this has led to the situation of where expressing a counter-argument within your group can lead to isolation from that group. Now, this was the witty little comment that was put up in Hong Kong at the beginning. And I think the good news that I have to offer in this particular presentation and the insights that I've provided is that we will not return to normal. The work from home is not a fad. Work from anywhere may happen one day, but unfortunately visas, taxes, incentives for corporations to put down headquarters and pay and government subsidies for feeding back into local economies, all of this precludes the true idea of being emancipated and being able to work in one country and yet enjoy the benefits of citizenry in another. I think it will be some time before we finally manage to move beyond our national boundaries. We have built a machine that spans national borders. It's easy to move our data faster and quicker than it is our human selves, especially now that we've been in a time of lockdown as well. So I wanted to put some meat on the bones, as it were, of cyber as we sort of wind down this presentation. I'm going to include the link, and I suggest that you seek out this analysis report, AR20-268 Alpha or A. Very easy to find. Read this report, because this is exactly what threat actors are doing now. This is the evolution to not just dropping a ransomware payload because, aha, I tricked you to open an attachment, or aha, I made you click on a link in social media, on Twitter, or on any other medium. This is the new threat. This is an advanced persistent threat actor and all of the steps that they took. This was unprecedented in terms of a release from the United States federal government on this malicious actor's activities. And it was startling to me. It really underscored the fact that 2015 to 2020, 5 years of progress, and we are nowhere because these same attacks are working over and over again. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown of how this attack took place. It's believed that the threat actors got a hold of valid Office 365 credentials and used that to VPN themselves into the network. Now, it's also believed that that VPN server had a particular vulnerability that could be exploited to enumerate various users along with their passwords. That's a pretty serious vulnerability, folks. But whatever the case, the one thing that could have fixed both of those problems was multi-factor authentication. It was found neither on the Office 365 nor on the VPN itself. Now, there is some questions around in the report, and I've read it a couple of times, and I really can't determine if the remote desktop server that they're talking about was either exposed to the internet or behind a VPN. So there is some questions around that. But whatever the case, access to that VPN server and access to the RDP server were not protected by multi-factor authentication either. So what we can see is the first three serious things that went wrong here were not about password hygiene, were not even about dark web monitoring, was not even about really fancy technology. It was this one piece of technology that could combat the people that use things like Summer123 or Password123 as their passwords. Multi-factor authentication was the key here to preventing this entire chain of attacks. Now, the vulnerability management piece comes in because obviously Office 365, the vulnerability management is Microsoft's responsibility. But there's a VPN server was vulnerable to a particularly nasty remote code execution bug that allowed the folks to enumerate VPN users. That was there was a patch for that a year and a half ago. Okay, so what we saw there is that the VPN server itself had a vulnerability that was in existence for a year and a half. So again, if the VPN server was part of this attack chain, this one patch could have fixed that issue, okay? The other thing that was interesting about this particular attack is it was a data exfiltration attack. And so it wasn't a dropping of a ransomware. And so you say, well, why is that so important? Well, what we've seen is in order to coerce organizations to come up with the money for the actual ransom, there is a piece now where they're data exfiltrating a mass amount of data. So they're holding that sensitive data hostage in hopes to compel you to pay the ransom, because many organizations are getting good at defeating the ransomware's encryption attempts, okay? We've gone to solutions like XDR and EDR and having the awareness of what a ransomware attack looks like and being able to respond quickly. So we now see the attack vector being the exfiltration of sensitive data, right? So again, the outbound connections at the firewall level, no geo IP restrictions. In this particular case, gigabytes of data, I believe it was 0.5 terabyte of data from their SharePoint, was exfiltrated to Finland. Think about this, US government agency seeing a ton of traffic going to Finland. You would think at the Network Operations Center or at the SOC Operations Center, that might throw up some old red flags. But again, there were no outbound restrictions from that RDP server, and the bad guys, to get a little bit technical here, were able to put SMB over port 443 outbound. So the firewall itself, had it been of a later generation, may have detected an anomaly, and certainly any SAM or any solution out there in the marketplace would have detected the fact that you're passing SMB over what should be an HTTPS port, right? Fair enough. The remote mounting of a share to Finland also would have been something that I think most modern security technology at the network layer would have gone, what? The other thing that was truly interesting, and there's a whole bunch of different opportunities to prevent and detect this attack from being successful, they were all missed. And interestingly enough, at least half of those 20 opportunities that I identified in the report, 10 did not require any security technology at all. Because what do we know about taking a whole bunch of data? It does two things to the server. First of all, massive spike in disk, massive spike in performance, and if they're, in this particular case they did, if they are zipping that into a giant file, massive CPU spike, right? So on the server itself, we see it from going perhaps between normal levels, and then all of a sudden, all the dials are slammed on it. And finally, at the network layer, you would think that it would be somewhat anomalous to see even more than a gigabyte of traffic going to a single IP address in Finland if you're a US government agency. So I'm not going through this to shame this government agency. But what I am trying to do is say, when we are confronted with this new breed of advanced persistent threat actor or cyber criminal that is looking to combine ransomware with holding your data hostage to blackmail you into paying a ransom, the attack chain is simple. You can defeat it, especially with something like multi-factor authentication and clamping down on the outbound connections that your network can make and monitoring the performance of your infrastructure. I put a few reference materials there on some of my writings, some of my rantings about threat intelligence, about what it can and can't do, and how it can make your organization far more secure. And with that, I'd love to turn it back to David and the team of Scott and Tracy. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. That was great, and I do have some questions here. Here's number one. You mentioned that many ransomware attacks now include a phase of data exfiltration prior to the attack. What are the best tools to
Best tools, right? So enabling NetFlow and getting some sort of aggregation of your network monitoring. So this can be done in things like Splunk It can be done through some SolarWinds tools. Specifically, I think it's called Network Monitor. And the later generation of firewalls can look at the traffic by asset, and they can also tell you top talkers, and they can throw alerts if they see particular traffic spikes. There's also another layer of technology, if you want to get really expensive, that looks at what normal activity is within the network itself and flags abnormal activity. This is known in at least Gartner qualities as User Entity Behavior Analysis, or UBEA solutions. And some of the newer firewalls are starting to use this type of stuff and use AI and machine learning to determine what appears to be unknown indications of compromise. So there's lots of good stuff out there.
Okay, great. Here is question number 2. You mentioned the difficulties of work from home versus work from everywhere, especially with Brexit. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, so really interesting. So many folks used to enjoy access to the EU and all of the EU countries in something they call the Schengen area. And unfortunately, as a result of Brexit, you're now limited to 90 days without applying for a visa within a 6-month period. So unfortunately, many folks that had a second home in Europe are no longer going to be able to access it at their leisure and for a lengthened period of time that they would like. There's also another particular problem, and this goes to state and federal, as well as here in the UK, government programs that incentivize research and development grants. And the idea of the research and development grant is to actually employ people, subsidize them in the country that research grant is being provided to the organization in hopes that money is reinvested into the local economy. So that doesn't happen if your workforce is now located all over the globe. A government would not want to subsidize an employee that isn't going to reinvest it into the local economy. So there are some big questions around the national boundaries. And like I said, we don't have a good solution yet to manage the global machine that we've created of the internet. And our notions of work and taxes and residency and visas are all going to come under assault as a result of the fact that work from home, I would really like that to be work from the Mexican Riviera.
Yeah, me too. Okay, I have one more question, and we have a few minutes, so audience members out there, if you want to shoot in a quick question, please do so. And here is the third question. The all-gas, no security, or rather minimal security approach to development, such as your Zoom example, horrifies me. Do you have other examples of this approach?
Absolutely, and in fact, we've had some giant botnets as a result of it. The entire IoT industry, or at least, no, that's unfair. Let's say 80%. I'm just going to pull a stat out of my butt here. Let's call it the vast majority of IoT devices built in, say, 3 years ago and downwards had all sorts of vulnerabilities. This is what made the Myra botnet so successful. As the rush to install IP cameras and DVRs and all of these other sexy IoT devices happened, the attack surface just phenomenally exploded. So that's a really great example of how security was pushed pretty much to the back burner. And unfortunately, we've seen it have tragic consequences. One could argue that the issues with the 737 MAX were related to software. And in fact, a modern airplane is a data center on wings with giant engines. So we are starting to see the tragic results of this reliance on IoT devices that are poorly protected or completely exposed and have vulnerabilities.
Okay, it looks like we might have a few minutes left. So how about you just wrap up your presentation? There are no more questions. It's like a 30-second elevator presentation. Just emphasizing the points you want the audience members to take away from your presentation today, and then turn it back to me, and we'll have a short break until the third segment.
Okay, that sounds good. So I think, my message is that we can approach this a number of different ways. I think as leaders in IT, we need to call this out. We need to help our organizations understand that what they did in a crisis situation may not be sustainable over the longer term. And this includes cleaning up things like globally exposing remote desktop servers or not having two-factor authentication licenses in place for Outlook Web Access. So I know what we did was out of an emergency in a crisis. And, you can go back to first aid and, the first thing you want to do is check to see if the person's breathing. And if they're not breathing, you start CPR. I think we ended up there in 2020. In 2021, I hope, look at trying to stabilize that patient and deal with the other ails that we have. And I don't necessarily look at this as a technology solution. A lot of it has to do with being able to properly articulate risk and understand how we talk to the decision makers and the people with access to the money. I found a lot of my success in dealing with large financial organizations and working as a security person was to get in front of the project management office and help try and get some security baked in to whatever projects were coming through, to explore the idea of running free tools against newly deployed web applications to try and intercept exposed vulnerabilities before they went to production, or understanding what the requirements are for an application that does indeed handle sensitive data and how that might be protected without, putting pressure on the time or delivery lines of the project. And also, I think we need to become acutely aware of what we have exposed. So tools like Shodan, tools like Gray Noise, tools that you can download and run your own vulnerability scans against your organization, or things like we have in the UK that involves the Shadow Server Network and the UK NCSC early warning. All of these tools are readily available, and some of them are at national levels and some of them are very inexpensive. And I find that we can get an awareness of what we have out there and we can fix it before it gets attacked and potentially owned. And I guess the last thing that I would say is let's just be aware of all of the things that are going on through resources like in the United States, the CISA, or the Critical Infrastructure Security Analysis Center, and their publications, paying attention to the press. A few Google alerts are a really great place to start your own open source intelligence, or perhaps if your risk requires it, a more paid for and tailored and bespoke threat intelligence program.
Okay, one more audience question squeezed in. Just please answer this shortly. Where do you go to keep on top of all your research? Name a few good ones.
Okay, so there's one thing that I do is I use an app called IG Home. It's a free app. And if you hearken back to the days of the Google homepage where you could drag in all sorts of news and all sorts of feeds, I have that. And what I've done is I've created a collection plan for all of the types of strategic information and kind of cybercrime information. I find that one of the most powerful teaching tools that I have is to download and review cybercriminal indictments because that tells you all about the attacks that the bad guys were using and how they conducted those attacks and ultimately how they were caught. And I use these a lot in teaching cyber threat intelligence analysts on what to look for and how to determine whether or not a threat actor is going to do or is going to weaponize a certain vulnerability. And we've seen this time and time again. We know that as soon as a public proof of concept is dropped on Twitter or on social media or in a blog, we know that the bad guys are watching. And we know they are going to quickly try and take that and use it to conduct attacks, usually on a global scale if they're a cyber criminal organization, or in a very focused manner if they are an advanced persistent threat actor that has more of an espionage mission and a less of let's make some cash real quick mission.
Okay, that's all of our questions, and that's the end of the presentation. And that was great stuff, Ian. I thank you very much for an excellent presentation. And I would like to thank, and I would also like to thank Cloud Health by VMware. And with that, I will turn it back to Tracy. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, David and Ian. That was a very thought-provoking presentation. I think it was really interesting, and I think the audience probably got a lot out of it and a lot of food for thought. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And now we're going to go on our final break until the top of the hour. But I just wanted to briefly let you know that the webcast is being recorded and will be available for replay, and you'll get an email about that on Monday. And also, there's several resources provided by Cloud Health by VMware on your console, as well as the presentations and the agenda. So thanks again, everybody. Please stay on for our third and final session of the day. We'll be right back, and please stand by. Thank you.
Welcome back to our third session. Scott, please take it away.
Thank you. Yes, and welcome back, everyone, and thanks for staying on the call. So this is Scott Becker again. I'm glad to be back with you for this third and final session of the day. So in the first session, we had an overview about modern IT infrastructure. In the second session, we looked at security. And for this third session, we're looking at backup and recovery, best practices for transforming your enterprise. And so I'm very pleased to be here with our third presenter, is Dave Kawula. He's Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting. Dave is a Microsoft most valuable professional, MVP, with more than 20 years of experience in the IT industry. And his background includes data communications networks within multi-server environments. And he's also led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. Additionally, he's been doing a lot of work lately on backup and recovery and disaster recovery, and especially ransomware and how that impacts those issues. So he's the perfect person to be presenting today. So Dave, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot, Scott, for having me on the call today. I really appreciate these opportunities to speak to your viewership and to share some of my real-world stories and notes from the field. I've been pretty deep in the backup and recovery side of the Microsoft world for probably about the last 10 years or so. And this landscape has really changed, especially with the worldwide pandemic with COVID-19 and everything that's going on. So I hope everyone enjoys the session. We do have a Q&A opportunity towards the end. So if you do have questions, feel free to ask those questions, and we'll see what we can get to at the end of the session. And with that, I think we'll get going. All right. So the first thing that I'd like to talk about today is some of our different options that we have in regards to disaster recovery. Inside of your organization, traditional DR would see us looking at two locations. Maybe your organization has a couple of co-location facilities. Maybe you've got facilities that you own, and we would look at what it would take to replicate and fail over to those other locations. And with modern technologies that we have available to us, we've got more options now available to us than ever before, especially when we look at failover options to the cloud. So when having these conversations with customers in regards to what should we do for backup and recovery, I like to tell them that the journey and the voyage to get to the cloud is going to be a hybrid approach. I have a few customers that are all cloud-driven right now, but most of them are still hybrid. So we've got some of our workloads that are going to remain on-prem. Maybe they have to stay on-prem forever. And in this journey, some of the things we have to look at is, when we have to fail over to the cloud, what's our recovery time going to look like? How many recovery points are we going to need? What are those objectives for the project? When we look at some of the tooling behind this, is it easy to set up? And you know what? I've done enough of these projects now that I hate to say that anything is easy in IT, because there's always complexities when we get into production environments. But it has become a lot easier to configure failover options with both backup and recovery to the cloud. And, having the ability to not only fail over to the cloud, but have the ability to fail back is also key for a lot of organizations where, we may only want to stay in the cloud for, a point of time, and then maybe we do want to come back. Or maybe we're going to use this as a migration swing. Maybe this event that's occurred has given us a motivation as an organization to start transitioning some of these workloads to the cloud. Now, one of the things when you're looking at backup and recovery options from a hybrid perspective is you have to take a look at your bandwidth considerations. And by that, most of the cloud providers, I'll use Microsoft as an example, provides free ingress traffic, and ingress being inbound traffic into their cloud. So that means that from a replication job perspective or a backup job perspective, we can ship that data to the cloud without incurring additional costs. At least that's the way it is today, and it has been for the last while. Where we run into some challenges, though, is what happens when we need to get that data back. That's when the meter starts clocking in, and you may not realize this at the time, but in a failed back scenario, this could actually be cost prohibitive for your organization. So one of the things that we recommend is to look at either WAN acceleration appliances to your cloud tenant. Some of the backup providers that are out there today actually offer built-in WAN optimization capabilities where we can cut down on the amount of traffic that we have going back and forth. The next kind of tip that I have around bandwidth considerations and optimizations is depending on the situation that you're in. If it is an emergency where we do have to fail over in short order, I talk to my customers about this all the time. If you're in a situation where you know that you're gonna have to fail over within the next couple hours because something's happening, maybe we know we're gonna lose power or something that's within our control, there's not a heck of a lot that we can do in that short time period. But if you do have extended notification, for example, I had a notification this week that there's going to be a sustained power outage in my area. Thank goodness it's not actually at the time of this presentation. That would be marginally problematic. But with extended notice, you can actually call your ISP and ask for a bump up in your bandwidth temporarily, especially if it's an emergency situation. And we've had good success with our customers doing that, where they've had the ability to go 10x their capacity on their pipe with just some software configurations. And so this gives us better options for taking and failing over. Right. And so the next one is when we look at the failover process, how easy is it to actually fail over, and what does this look like in regards to a failover and a failback process? I call it the big red button. And so in the event of an emergency, press the big red button to fail over. And does that big red button actually work? And so I like to tell customers that we've got two big red buttons that we've got. We've got a planned big red button, and we've got an unplanned big red button to press. And the planned one is what we would call a planned failover and planned failback. And that process involves some synchronization of the source worker virtual machines or physical infrastructure that we're replicating to our destination, be it the cloud or be it another data center. And the second one is an unplanned event, and that would be a catastrophic loss of power. We've had situations with natural disasters all over the world this year, and more hurricanes than what we've seen in given history. We've got catastrophic fires that are hitting the West Coast, and there are loss of power with that. And unfortunately, reality for a data center, loss of power is not something that's sustainable for an extended period of time, because the generators will run out of fuel at a certain point, and we will go down. And so in that case, when we have to fail over like that, there is no synchronization. And we can look at using that as a failover mechanism. Now, when we do that, there are intangibles that come with that process, where we have to say, listen, have we tested the re-IPing of all of these workloads going up to our destination location? Is it cloud or is it on-prem? Does this work? Have we looked at our firewall rules, our DNS rules, and things like that? Right. So those are just a couple of the key starting points. The next one is your DR plan. When you're looking at traditional DR, normally we would have a hybrid of two DR plans that we would have. We would have that plan failover where we know that we need to move over to the alternate site, and we know that it's going to be a synchronization process. It may take a little longer to fail over, but it's a little bit more of what we'll call like an application-aware failover, where we're synchronizing things and we've got an as-is state that's moving over to the destination. Second one is, and many of you that are listening on this call will probably have to go through this scenario. I've had attendees of my sessions raise their hands that you've had natural disasters. One of them was in the Midwest U.S., and they had a tornado completely take out the data center. There was nothing left in the source data center. So in that case, that natural disaster, we consider that an unplanned failover. So we know that there's going to be some loss of data, but we've got to go to the last recovery point that we've got either in the cloud or in the alternative data center. And those are the two traditional DR plans that we would look at. Now, in comes COVID-19, 2020. What a year this has been. We'll rewind back to around February of this year. All of a sudden, we get the phone calls as IT professionals and consultants. Everyone's being sent home. Everyone needs to work from home. Get VPN access to all users. Well, the reality of this was that most organizations were probably not set up for an at-home work-from-home strategy. And so we rushed. I'm not going to lie, most organizations really rushed through this process because our number one goal was to get employees back to work. They need remote access. They need the ability to connect in. And so the unfortunate consequence of this was a lack of security on those endpoints that we were connecting from. And this created a huge attack surface for our threat actors that were out there. And we've seen such an increase in ransomware, hacks, malware inside of customer environments. 2020's so far been a year like no other that I've seen. It's almost like we're at a cyber war right now. You can't even go by a single day without having feeds coming up in social media that another major organization has been attacked. And you're going to be different size organizations on this call. If you're a small to mid-sized customer and you think that the attackers are just going to go after the large companies, you're kidding yourself. They go after anybody that they can get their hands on. So if you're not for profit, if you're a small organization, medium organization, large government organization, healthcare, all under attack. And with this, it's not just a typical phishing attack that we're seeing. It's where we actually are getting attacked and hacked, where the threat actors are actually potentially in the networks for an extended period of time. And from a DR perspective, this is where it becomes a little bit challenging because from DR, if the threat actor is actually inside of our network, and we've seen multiple cases with customers that we've worked with this year where the threat actors have actually gained administrative access. Well, if they've got administrative access and they're in there for an extended period of time, the first thing that they start looking for before they'll go ransom everything is they go start looking for all of your backups that you've got. They'll go start hunting, seeing if they can figure out where things are stored. Are these stored on NAS devices? Are they stored in the cloud? Can we gain access to the tenant where these are stored? Can they gain access to the DR farms that we've got? Because that's going to be the first attack point that they're going to typically go after. They're going to try to remove our capability of restoring, of failing over. They want to take away that big red button. And so I like to throw this into all of my presentations now because it is so important that, if I was doing this in a live presentation, I'd be asking you to put your hands up. So this will be a virtual thing where we'll put some hands up. And it would be a question that I would ask the audience of how many individuals on this call would consider themselves IT security professionals? And if this was a live presentation, I'd have a scattering of hands that would go up. So if I had 300, 400, 500 people in the room, maybe 10% would put up their hands. This needs to change. What needs to change with this is every single one of us needs to put up our hands. We all need to become part of the security organizations that we belong to. And we need to at least participate and include our security teams in things like our DR plans, because this incident of a cybersecurity attack where we could have a whole level attack where it is technically unrecoverable is a very bad spot to be. And I'll give you a story a little bit later on in the presentation as to what one of these attacks looks like, but you definitely need to update your DR plans right now, adding cybersecurity attacks into your DR plans and your strategies. And so this is something that is just so key right now because, burying your head in the sand is not an approach that is going to work. And if you say that it's only going to be the guys down the street that are going to be hit, not us, well, we've had situations where I had a customer that was in manufacturing, and their supply chain actually got hit, and it actually impacted their business because they didn't have materials to continue the line. And so that raised awareness with the executive saying, hey, what are we doing for our cybersecurity awareness? And do we have prevention mechanisms in place for this? Okay, so the next one is for your DR plans. Your DR plans need to be tested. All right, so this is something that we've all known. You go through your annual DR test. And so one of the things I want to add to this annual DR test is the fact that you need to have simulated scenarios that you're going to model saying, listen, if we did lose admin access, what does this mean? Are we in a recoverable state? Are we going to have to pay the ransom? Will paying the ransom even work? What does this look like? How are we going to get back in operation? How long are we going to be down in this particular scenario? So one of the things that we're recommending when talking to our customer base that's out there is it's so important to add these simulated attacks into your DR testing. And so you can hire organizations that can come in and they can, we can figure out where the holes are that are inside of your organization and then plug up those holes. And the landscape is changing so fast that we're actually recommending this now as a biannual exercise. Don't just leave it to the end of the year, and don't just deal with this after you've gone through an attack. As I mentioned earlier, these threat actors, typically when they get into an organization and they've hacked their way through, they typically will get access to DR. And so what are some of the things that we can do to prevent that from happening? So I know we wanted to talk about some tips. The major attacks, the unrecoverable attacks that we've seen, and I've been personally involved in 2 of these this year already, were situations where we had a very flat environment. And this flat environment consisted of a single domain and a single forest. Well, as Microsoft professionals, we've been going around for years telling you, consolidate your Active Directory. More forests and more domains are just more complicated for everyone. Just consolidate. Go down to a single domain and forest. Well, you have a single pane to attack with a single domain and forest, and that's as simple as that. The other thing is that the single forest and domain might have been around for a very long time. Active Directory started in Windows 2000. A lot of these organizations have been running the same domain since Windows 2000, talking over 20 years ago now. And these things have been upgraded to Windows 2003, 2008, 2012, 2016, 2019. You could have jumped through 6 or 7 different versions of Active Directory. And so you could have a lot of holes that still need to be plugged inside of there. So from our perspective and my personal perspective in the Zero Trust model, it is very hard to lock down that existing environment and to ensure and guarantee that, especially to the executives that are listening, that, that's going to be secure and, we're going to be able to take and completely lock this down. It's a difficult task because it's been around for a very long time. So one of the things to consider is that I personally recommend setting up what's called a guarded fabric. And what that consists of is setting up a separate domain, separate forest for your critical resources. And this would be your virtualized infrastructure. This would be your backup targets. This would be your replica targets that you have. Totally separate set of credentials inside of there, limited administrator access. And this would also include adding multi-factor authentication to not only that new fabric environment, but also consider it for your key and critical servers. Console level access is very, very bad. That level of access is going to allow those threat actors to persist and move through the environment a lot faster. One of the things that I'll bring up to consider is that with the strains of ransomware that are out there, the Ryuk especially, using Cobalt Strike V2, they're saying now that from time of attack to time of complete compromise and lockdown, it could be as little as 5 hours. 5 hours. So if you got hit in the middle of the night, you could be locked down by the time you come in the morning. Now, from what we've seen through some of the forensic analysis through the last couple engagements that I've been involved in, the threat actors have actually hung out for a lot longer than that. And so what's happened is they wait and they take and they scout the environment to see what's there. All right, so the last thing is just remember, add your security teams into your DR and operations teams. So important right now. Okay, so some of the intangibles when we look at sailing over to either another environment, maybe it's a different co-location, or it could be the cloud. Because I've been involved in so many of these ransomware incidents with customers over the last handful of years, some of the intangibles, and the biggest one for me is documentation. You're going to have a call-down list that you're going to have in the event of a DR situation, be it option 1 where it's a planned failover, option 2 where it's an unplanned failover due to natural causes, and the third one be a cybersecurity attack. If it is a cybersecurity attack and you've got this documentation living on a file server somewhere and that file server happens to be ransomed, it's absolutely pointless. It's pointless to have that set up like that. So I always recommend having a printed copy, the break glass binder that you got with the contacts and call down lists that you need and the procedures that you should follow, because it was not even a month ago that we just went through this. How was that infrastructure built again? Oh, well, we've got the instructions on the file server. Well, what happened to the file server? The file server was ransomed. How do we get access to that? Well, we can't. Well, that's a problem. Printed copy or offline copy of this documentation is so key, all right? Now, when we go to fail over to another environment, be it cloud or on-prem to another co-location facility, you're typically going to have to change the IP addresses of your servers because you're going to be on some type of a different subnet and VLAN infrastructure or VXNet or something like that at the remote site. So you want to make sure that you test your application stack to make sure that it's going to work well in the event of a failover. And this also includes changing external firewall rules and things like that to regain external access. It could be something as simple as, how are we going to get employees back into the environment? So are we going to have some type of virtual desktop infrastructure spun up for them? And what does that look like? And how do we spin it up? And do we spin it up ahead of time? Do we just have it running dormantly in the tenant and then press the go button to activate some pools so that users can log in, they can get back in? Are we going to have, VPNs available? Do the VPNs work in the cloud? Is it the same firewall model, or are we using, for example, the cloud version of that firewall? Does it actually work? Are end users set up to use this? Another big one with the second point here on how long does it take to execute the planned failover is you've got a little tricky portion of this called DNS cache that lives on your clients. And so if you know that you're going to be going through a planned failover exercise, dropping the TTL, the time to live down on some of these key records for infrastructure that you know that you need to connect to is going to be really key, because if there's stale caches on those clients, they could have to take and have manual intervention. And I hate to say just reboot your machine and things will work, but we can prevent a lot of those pieces by looking at, what does this failover look like? And this is where it's important to proceed with that annual DR testing and failover plans. Second one is for immediate failover, what type of data loss are we going to sustain with that? How many recovery points can we actually have at that remote location? Do we have enough for a week to fail over, a month? Do we have, what are our objectives that we have to keep? Are there certain requirements that we have to keep data for a certain amount of time? If we do want to take and fail over and fail back, what does the resync and reseed time look like? Well, you've got to test this. And the last one is, remember, the egress cost of bandwidth out of most public cloud providers, they do charge for this. So you're going to have to look at what those costs look like. One other little trick here as well is, depending on where you're storing, what type of storage you're using for your replicated infrastructure, if it is up in the cloud, there's different tiers of storage that you can buy, especially if it's stored in blob storage, where we can have cool storage, we can have hot storage, we can have archive storage, and all of these come with a different price point. We had a ransomware situation where we did have to recover from a cloud tier that we were bringing back down earlier this year. what we did is we actually cut a support ticket with Microsoft. We let them know that it was a ransomware incident and we needed to bring back data faster. And they actually helped us through the process of changing the tiers in our blob storage to try to improve the egress bandwidth and how fast we could pull that data out. Right. The second thing was we made a phone call to our ISP and they gave us 10x the pipe, actually at no charge because we were in a critical situation at that time. Now let's just say that we like being in the cloud. We've now failed over to the cloud and we want to stay there. Well, what are some of the tricks that you can have to reducing some of those costs in the cloud? Well, the first thing is an analysis of your workloads. Do those workloads need to be on 24/7 by 365? Because unlike your on-prem infrastructure, where we've got typically a CapEx cost for the servers and then some OpEx costs that we would run to drive that out through, its life cycle of 5 years. In the cloud, you're typically getting charged by the hour for this infrastructure. And when you're getting charged by the hour for this infrastructure, if we can reduce those costs, for example, if we said, listen, that virtual machine was a dev test VM and, the tester's only on there 12 hours a day maximum, maybe we can have some auto start and auto stop scripts that we run against that. We can always turn it back on, but even in cutting that down, let's just pick a number, like a round number here. Let's say that virtual machine was costing $100 a month for 24-hour usage on it. And if you cut it in half, well, roughly you cut the cost by 50%. It's not exactly 50% because there are some standby charges with most of the providers, but let's just pick some round numbers so the math is easy. So we'll say it's 50% of the cost. So now we're down to $50 to run that VM. Well, another thing to consider is for those workloads is you can actually pre-purchase reserved instances and reserved capacity for those virtual machines. So in this case, if we're using reserved instances, the last time that I set this up for a customer, the 3-year net savings was 65%. That's significant. So now if you ran that VM half the time and you took and you had a 65% discount, your savings start to add up real fast because now maybe I can actually run that virtual machine 24 hours a day and I'm still saving money. All right. Now the same plays true for blob storage. You don't have to pay retail. It's a funny story. My wife loves to go shopping and she loves to find bargains. And the bargains that she loves to find, whenever I go shopping, she says, Dave, I don't pay retail for anything. I want to find a deal. I want to find a bargain. And that's the same approach you have to take with your cloud. Find a bargain. You're not just going to go walk into your cloud provider store and pay MSRP or above MSRP. And so make sure that you negotiate these things. And that's my next point that I have for you. Watch your cloud service providers' billing and markup that they're charging you for these services. So we now want to fail over to the cloud. I had an instance this year where we were working with a customer that was working with the cloud service provider, and they were actually providing a pretty healthy markup on top of the suggested MSRP that the cloud provider was offering. And we actually didn't even find this out until we went into a direct bill relationship. So, for example, Microsoft offers a direct bill option. And so we actually found a significant cost savings, and we reduced by an additional 40%. They were charging us an additional 40% on top of what the MSRP was. Even though Microsoft wasn't giving us much of a discount beyond the MSRP prices, it was still significant. We saved another 40% right there. And so you can see how this drives your costs way down. Don't be scared to negotiate those prices, and don't just walk into the store and pay full price. All right. So especially if you're going to be looking at staying in the cloud for an extended period of time, you can negotiate. All right. And so these prices, and depending on what size of organization, you may get government discounts or not-for-profit discounts or educational discounts or healthcare discounts. Ask. If you don't ask, then you're just going to continue to pay full price. The last tip that I have in regards to staying in the cloud for an extended period or finishing migrating up there in the DR event is don't just throw your credit card into that tenant, because if you just go in straight credit card billing, you're probably paying full price, and that's probably not a great idea. Okay. I told you I had a little story that I was going to tell you as part of this presentation, and this story starts a little something like this. The story starts with a phone call that I received one Monday morning. And it's actually two Monday mornings because this has actually happened to me twice this year in 2020 already. And I actually happened to miss this last customer's call, which occurred just under a month ago here. And the customer, it wasn't a customer that we had worked with a lot. We've done some work with them. But then the director of IT texts me. It's one word. And I just know if somebody calls me up out of the blue like this and the conversation starting off like that, I said, oh, please tell me you have not been ransomware. And he comes back and texts me back and says, oh, yeah. He says one word, and it was Rayek. And so it was not good. And so this was what I talked about earlier with having that flat single attack space. They had a single domain, single forest. The attack came in like this. They had an individual that was phished on a workstation, and they were able to take and load some software, some keystroke logging software up on the workstation, caused enough havoc on the workstation to have a help desk professional dial into the machine remotely. And when they dialed in remotely, of course, they had admin credentials, not just admin credentials. They had domain admin credentials, and it was not hard to harvest those credentials for the threat actor. And so now they had what they needed. And you know what they did? They sat there for I'm not going to say they sat there. They were working on the inside for a month with this account. And there was no two-factor authentication and all those things that I talked to you about earlier. And a long story short, they figured out where all the backups were. They figured out where all the replicas were. And then they went into group policy and they created a scheduled task to deploy the workload. It hid and it manifested and mapped itself on all the workstations. And on that fateful Monday morning when this kicked off, it was actually the Sunday before that it actually kicked off. Everything was down. The workstations were down. The servers were down. Everything. We had a Hyper-V infrastructure, so they had access to all of that. And so I tell you, it's not good. And so this organization ended up having to pay the ransom. You think to yourself, wow, that's the last thing that we want to do as an organization is to have to pay the ransom. So part of the process of paying the ransom was to have to take and contact their cybersecurity insurance provider. This is your tip number one of this presentation, is you need cybersecurity insurance. If you don't have it, go and get it, get stuff quote on it. Do what you need to get this in place. They did have it, and it wasn't good standing, so that was good. So they did what they were supposed to. You open up your policy. They have a bat phone that you have to take, and you have to pick up and call this number. Call this number in the event of an incident. Okay, so then the insurance company sent in the cybersecurity forensic analysis team to see what was going on. And from our perspective as IT, we're hands off at this point in time because we need to figure out what's going on. We were completely down, dead in the water. We ran on-prem Exchange. We had all of our workloads were down. Everything was down. The whole organization was down at this point in time. Well, we weren't allowed to touch anything going on the better part of 5-6 days while they were figuring this out. And then we discovered that we were at the point where backups are unrecoverable because we didn't have a guarded fabric where we could restore from. And we came to the realization that they had to pay. So the payment process was the cybersecurity insurance company had another company that they dealt with, special negotiating organization that does nothing but try to reduce and negotiate the ransoms based on what the organization can pay. And so they come to a set number that they have to pay. And this was new to me. I actually, this was just as of a month ago going through this process that I learned this. The organization was actually forced to come up with the cash to pay the ransom, strong six-figure amount. And then you go through a reimbursement phase with the cybersecurity insurance vendor. So if you don't right now, you need to make sure to look at how much your policy is going to give you. I was dealing with another customer a few weeks ago where they said, oh, well, you know what, we're protecting ourselves. We put $6 million in coverage inside of here, and that should be more than enough. And I talked to the CISO and the director of IT, and I said, well, based on my experience, is your insurance company going to pay that for you, or are you going to have to come up with potentially $6 million? Do you have a $6 million slush fund just kicking around? This was a government organization. Everything was done by fiscal budgets. You don't typically have a fund that's sitting around with just an extra $60 million in it. So I said, you best be getting on the phone and phoning your cybersecurity insurance vendor and finding out what this process looks like. And that's my next piece of advice for everybody on this call. If you have a cybersecurity insurance policy, phone your provider and go through a mocked-up scenario saying, we've got a whole level attack and we're going to have to pay. What does this look like? How does this play out? How long does this take? Who are the companies that you're going to bring in to help with this? Can we bring in our own companies that help that know our own infrastructure? What does this actually look like? Now, the scarier part about all of this, and this is why you need to make sure that you've got some type of an air-gapped or immutable backup that the bad guys can't get their hands on. I like to say that if you're a smaller organization and you can fit all of your infrastructure on a 10 terabyte encrypted USB drive, do it. Have it off the network, because in this situation, we would have taken going back a week in time, no problem. Even if it took a week to pull all the data off the drive and get everything back up and running, because when we got the decryption key, you're thinking to yourselves, right on, we're going to be able to bring everything back and everything's just going to work. Wrong. When we got the decryption key, it brought back the data only. The ransom and the encryption process had trashed all of our Windows installs in the infrastructure, including all of our Windows 10 desktops, including all of our application servers, including our SQL servers, including everything for this organization. Luckily for them, we did have some immutable copies that we were able to bring back for some of the infrastructure. So, we were able to bring back some SQL. We were able to bring back some of the important Exchange data more easily. And so this actually made our process of recovery a little easier for this client. But if you didn't have a way to take and bring that back, you would be in very big trouble, because I'm going to ask every single person that's listening to this webinar today, have you documented 100% everything that's been deployed inside of your infrastructure? And I'm talking every IIS server, every Citrix server, every SQL server, every Oracle server. Well, us in IT, we troubleshoot. We have tickets. Things change. I don't know very many organizations that come back to me and say 100% guaranteed we know how every single one of these servers works. Because here's what happens. You have organizations where you have individuals that work for the organizations that have that knowledge of how things are put together, how they're glued together. And then that knowledge leaves. And then somebody new has to come in and take over. And this is the life of IT. We have to pick up the pieces where they're left off. And when our job is to keep the lights on green and keep things running, we'll go back to an end-of-day scenario like this. It's not good news. So make sure that you have that immutable air-gap backup copy, either in the cloud, separate credentials, something that you can take and come back from. And I'm just going to let you also know that the bad guys that are out there are really smart. So just because you have that immutable copy that you may be able to restore your infrastructure, you still might be paying the ransom. And say, what do you mean, Dave? Why am I still having to pay the ransom? I'm not paying these bad guys a dime. I don't take and I don't negotiate with terrorists. I'm not going to take and I'm not going to pay these guys anything. That's our policy as an organization. Well, let me give you one more little story to chew on here a little bit. And this little story was an attack about a month ago for a Finnish healthcare provider, widely hit the news. This was the first one that I'd seen like this. They didn't go back to the organization for money. They cracked all the healthcare records and they went for a monetary sum to every single patient. So they went to the patients and said, we are going to release all of this data that we have for you unless you pay us a sum. Okay, so the threat actors will upload copies of your data before they take and fully encrypt it and have a copy of it, and that's their back door that they have. to say, listen, you may have gotten us, and you've beaten us by having this air-gapped and immutable copy that you can restore to, but guess what? We still have your data. So this is why it's ever important to have those conversations with your cybersecurity insurance vendors that are out there, and have plans in place for your DR plan as to what you are going to do if this type of attack occurs. Okay, it's so important to think about this today. The number of attacks have escalated so much to the point in 2020 that I like to tell customers and individuals I'm talking to that it's almost like we're at cyber war right now. You can't even go a single day without finding out another organization that has been hit. All right. Okay, the next one is the 2 attacks that I've seen this year have come in via help desk accounts that have overprivileged rights. So a couple things that you need to think about with this is that, especially if you're going to be looking at failing over to the cloud, do not just spin up a tenant in the cloud. I'm a Microsoft expert, so I understand the things in the Microsoft space and the Microsoft cloud. And so some of the things that you can do in Azure when you spin up a tenant, if you're not sure how to lock things down and go to role-based access and the best practices, is you can look at what's called the Cloud Adoption Framework from Microsoft. It's prescriptive guidance on how you should set up your tenant. Beyond that, they've got templates in place depending on what type of security and compliance you need inside of your tenant. If it's PCI, if it's NIST, if it's HIPAA, whatever your requirements happen to be, they've got templates to help you lock that down. And so make sure that you do that. More importantly, on-prem, you want to be looking at privileged access workstations inside of your Zero Trust model and really reducing what our individuals can gain access to on the network. Having a service account with domain admins access, very bad idea, very easy to jump around and have lateral movement with that. Having universal administrator access across all of our workstations, a very bad idea. The lateral movement will happen fast with that as well. So look at the solutions that are put forth by our vendors to take and lock this down. All right. So the next thing is when we look at a couple more points here when we're looking to move to the cloud, are you going to be locked in to your cloud provider? For example, are you going to have to change your virtual machine format to run in a particular cloud? So we're coming from one type of virtual machine. Are we going to have to convert that so that it runs in that cloud? And can we easily migrate back if we want to? Is there capability, or is it going to be a one-way street? And one of the things to look at with this is looking at either cross-cloud VR, something to think about very seriously, because there have been widely public outages with 2 of the major cloud providers this year, big outages. And you have to think about that because there's a lot of pieces that are out of your control if that happens. And is the business going to accept the fact that, listen, we're going to be down for an extended period of time because we just can't do anything now? You're either okay or not okay with that. If you're not okay with that, you've got to make sure that you've got VR back to your hybrid environment, back on-prem for those critical workloads, because you don't want to be having to shut down because of a vendor public cloud-related outage that is completely out of your control. All right, a couple of the costly mistakes that we'll review here, and then, Scott, I think we'll have some time to take a few questions here, is when we're looking at VR to the cloud specifically, what are some of the costly mistakes that I've seen organizations make? Oversizing virtual machines is number one. Just because you ran a virtual machine with 64 gigs of RAM on-prem because you had it, doesn't mean that you actually needed 64 gigs of RAM to drive that workload. Maybe it would have run fine with 8 gigs of RAM or 16 gigs of RAM. Maybe you didn't need to go to that ultra-fast SSD tier of storage. Maybe just regular SSD storage or HDD tier of storage would have been fine. What are your actual IOPS and throughput requirements for that particular VM? You need to analyze each and every one of these workloads that you're moving over there because, like I said earlier, the costs are not CapEx. They're operationalized on an hourly basis for most of these services, and you can find you save yourself a lot of money with that. So number one, look at to see if you can go into some type of shutdown mechanism with those VMs once you're looking at migrating them up to the cloud permanently. Number two, look to see for VM reservations. With those VM reservations, you can typically save a lot of money inside of there. As I mentioned, choosing your hard drives is going to be important. Understanding your bill. CSP overcharge has been a big issue of mine. You as the consumer, it's up to you to go do your shopping. If you're prepared to pay over MSP, there's probably nothing in the cloud service provider licensing agreement that says they can't do that. They can charge, what the market will bear and what the market will demand. It's up to you to understand what MSRP is and to do your negotiation. And remember that, Microsoft actually has a direct bill model as well, too, that's available for you. And one of the things that I actually liked about the Microsoft direct bill model lately is that the invoicing portion, specifically in Azure, comes back to you as the subscriber in that direct bill model, so we don't have to wait for the CSP to bill us and to understand that. We're seeing the native billing format that Microsoft is providing, not something that the CSP is taking and making a little bit more complicated for us. And with that, Scott, I think we'll see. Were there any questions that were out there for us?
Yeah, we've got a couple. And thanks, Dave. Great information. In some of the questions, they actually, so you told some stories about cybersecurity insurance policies, and that was really valuable because that's such a gray area for so many people. It's like it's something that I suspect is on a lot of 2021 to-do lists, as to look into those and figure out whether you need one. And some of the the real world stories that you have there about how those work have been incredibly valuable. So you gave the piece of advice that people ought to seriously consider buying one. For people who do have them, how often do you recommend that they review them?
Sorry, Scott, you kind of broke up there for a second. Can you repeat the question?
Sure. For people who do have the security insurance policies, how often do you recommend that they review those?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's a super key point. Great question. I recommend that right now that you review those biannually, just based on the fact that the threat landscape is changing. Interestingly enough, that concept of reviewing your cybersecurity insurance policy, many of you may know that my wife Crystal is actually a Microsoft MVP as well. So she works with me on a daily basis in our consulting practice. And she's actually reviewing one of these policies with me, and she happened to point out a very important piece that was inside of there. One of the policies, Scott, actually provided some level of pen testing as part of the policy, and they actually highly recommended it. Now, I don't know if the insurance company was going to charge an additional fee for that, but the insurance company was actually recommending that as part of the review process. So, yeah, absolutely. Pick up your policy, figure out what's inside of it. Like I said, they'll have some phone numbers and some emails to contact them, and definitely go through that modeled scenario saying, hey, listen, we're in a bad way here, and I think that we're going to potentially have to pay the ransom. What does this look like for us? Because some of the pieces that I found out recently, Scott, that were covered, at least in the policy for the very last incident that we were dealing with, is the customer wanted to bring us in for recovery services, so they wanted to help us rebuild some of the infrastructure. And we had to present a statement of work to the insurance company, and the insurance company actually covered our bill for recovery services. Now, it was only to go back to an as-is state. We couldn't do like any improvements or anything like that, but as part of that recovery service, initially the insurance company was going to take and bring in a third-party vendor, and the organization actually felt a little bit more comfortable working with us because we had helped to set up the infrastructure years gone by. So there wasn't really a learning curve for that. So for any of the consultants that are out there, consultancy firms that are listening in, understand that that's part of that negotiation process. So my recommendation is to say, listen, we're modeling up this event and something has happened and we're potentially going to have to pay. can we bring in our own consultants for part of the recovery and remediation efforts? And what does that look like, and what's our coverage look like for that?
Yeah, and this is something I'm not sure if you've had enough individual experiences with the the insurance situations, but does it make it more likely that a company is or an organization is going to pay out if they have an insurance policy? Like, do the insurance companies sort of lean toward that as sort of like a cleaner way to get out of it, or do they make a serious effort to try not to? And
well,
and looking at the long-term expenses of fixing the infrastructure problems that maybe led to the breach in the first place.
So,
Vortex.
So threat actor is very smart. So if that is the case, and what I've seen, and I can only speak to my personal experience on this and what I've done research on, Scott, is we're finding that the payout amounts are substantially higher for organizations that have insurance, because they know that you've got insurance, because it's the negotiating team that's contacting them. And they've probably been in contact in the past, because there's only so many cybersecurity insurance vendors that are out there. And so with that being said, they will negotiate those amounts, and the amount was covered, but the amount had to be paid up front. But in my personal opinion, is it increasing the dollar figure for what is actually getting paid out? Yeah, I would think so. And at a certain point in time, one has to think that, insurance companies traditionally have been in the for-profit business. They're not in the business to lose money. Their policies eventually will take and make them money. They wouldn't be around if they weren't. And so at a certain point in time, we also have to think about, what's that going to do to our ongoing premiums? Because the premiums that we have start at, $5,000. Now, what are they going to be post-event, post-case? Because anybody that's had to go through a home insurance claim can speak to this, is the fact that you put in a claim and you lose your claims-free discount, right? That next claim that you put in, not only do you have to pay the deductible, your premiums are going to go up. And I ran into that with a situation where we had a backup in our basement, and it cost a little over $100,000 to fix this. My premiums doubled, and I asked them how long. They said forever. Yeah. They're going to make back their money. So that's another piece that we've got to look at with this as well. It's not just that payout. Is that what's that going to look like to your long-term premiums?
Right. Yeah, interesting. So many wrinkles to that question. I do have one more question before we get to that. I want to do something. We had a drawing as part of the registration process for this summit, and it was for a high-end Bose wireless Bluetooth headphone set, the Bose Quiet Comfort 35 model. And so we have a winner for that, and I just wanted to announce it. It's Terrence Banks, NYC Parks, has won the headphones. So congratulations to Terrence. We'll be getting in touch with you about delivery. So Dave, one last question, and this is about your tip about savings, or your slide about savings with cloud providers. You've gone through, I think, 6 or 7 items there. But is there one or two that you highly recommend as kind of getting people the best bang for their buck? On negotiating with their cloud providers, or
the easiest, absolute easiest one to look at right out of the gate, Scott, is those VM and blob storage reservations. The bang for your buck that you get out of those is significant. And if you look at that on top of shutting down some of those workloads that don't need to be running 24/7, I've seen operational costs reduce on running that personal infrastructure as much as like 65 to 70%. That's significant.
Super. And I guess the last thing is, just if there's if you've got a sort of a top takeaway, from the day, from your session, that you really hope people will remember, what would that be for 2021?
Yeah, for sure. So my top takeaway for organizations right now is do not leave the planning exercises around cybersecurity and your DR plan, cloud or on-prem, until after you've had an attack. You need to start planning for that now. Plan for the day that something happens, because dealing with it after the fact is a lot more difficult than taking and putting in preventative measures ahead of time. And I'll leave with this note. I was actually reading an article. Our local news that we have up in Canada is called the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Scott, CBC. And they actually had a publication that came out today that said cybersecurity spending in 2020, 2021, and onward looking is going to be significantly increased due to COVID-19. So my conversation about those endpoints, the unsecured portions of our network, you need to make sure that you ramp up your budgets, everyone, because I really don't think it's going to get any better before it gets worse. And hopefully you can take some of these tips and tricks, and in the day that something does happen, hopefully you've got plan A, B, and C to get yourself out of a tight situation.
Great advice and a great takeaway. So, Dave, thanks for an excellent presentation today. Really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott.
And I also want to thank Cloud Health by VMware for making this summit possible. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Tracy for some closing notes.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. And thank you to both of you. That was a really interesting session, and I really appreciate you both taking your time today and sharing your expertise with us at our 2021 The Modern IT Infrastructure Summit. And I would like to thank all the speakers who took time to join us and make this such a great event today. Also, I'd like to give a special shout out to today's sponsor, Cloud Health by VMware, who made today's event possible. We really appreciate their support. And finally, thank you to the audience for joining us and staying on until the end. We appreciate your attention and hope you've gained a lot of new knowledge. One last thing, I have a favor. We'd love to hear what you thought of today's event. Please complete the short survey that pops up when you exit and tell us your thoughts and what we can do to make it better. And with that, a final thank you to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, and this concludes the summit.